So, hello everyone. It's my pleasure to have with me today Brandon Rowan, also known as Bureaucratic. Hi, Brandon.
Hello, how you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for agreeing to come on the channel and give an interview.
Of course, man. It's my pleasure.
Let me just say a few words to put the interview in context. So, you're, I'd say, a hip hop electronic music producer. Would that be a correct classification?
Absolutely. I think that I usually go by instrumental hip hop,
Okay.
so I think that works perfectly.
So Brandon is a young but very talented music producer. He has agreed to come on the channel, talk a bit about his music making process. Uh, I'm actually, for me, this is kind of a new experience because I don't usually listen to hip hop, but I came across your music a few months ago on
Hmm.
another YouTube channel by PJ. I think his name is Lugori, but he has a channel called Kick the PJ.
Absolutely.
And I thought that immediately it struck me as extremely different and actually really extraordinary music.
Well, thank you.
And it's also interesting for me, not coming from a hip hop perspective, to kind of hear about your workflow, and I think the viewers themselves would appreciate it as well.
Excellent.
So let me start by the mandatory plug. So there are links in the description to Brandon's music. I urge you all to just, if you haven't heard him yet, maybe go and check him out. You have a Bandcamp, right, Brandon?
That's correct. That's how I distribute pretty much all of my music is through Bandcamp.
Okay, great. So there are links in the description, and we'll probably reference a few of them as we go along this chat.
Mhm.
Okay, so you classify yourself as a hip hop producer, instrumentalist.
Mhm.
Uh, let's sort of, or maybe take me through your process of growing up musically. So when did you first get exposed to or music, and what was the sort of music you started listening to uh, as a teenager or a young child?
You have a cat with you, huh?
Yeah, they're
Very
actually
nice.
my cats are actually regulars on the channel,
Very good.
and she's actually trying to get in the room, but she's barred from entering for this interview.
No music theory today.
No, not for her.
So anyway, yeah, so I actually grew up listening to a lot of classic rock, British Invasion, and progressive rock when I was younger. Basically, my music experience was limited to listening to the radio
Hmm.
in the car. We were lucky. I grew up around Philadelphia, Pennsylvania,
Hmm.
and we had two great classic rock stations there. So that was kind of my fare growing up. And I always took a liking to some of the bands that were a little bit more on the progressive side, and ultimately towards jazz fusion was where I found that the bands that I was listening to, for example, Steely Dan was
Hmm.
huge for me and still to this day, as well as, for example, Yes or Jeff Beck. Eventually, I found my way through some of my parents' record collection. It was really just a CD collection, but to, for example, like Chick Corea, um, and also into the funk realm. Like I found George Clinton, and I found some rare soul and groove. I happen to have an uncle who's very involved in record collecting, and he
Hmm.
kind of introduced me to a lot of that late '60s, early '70s obscure soul that I basically found out later on was what became the basis for all the hip hop of the last 30 years basically. So I guess I developed the appreciation for the music that hip hop was based on first, and then throughout my mid-teens, I suppose, my older brother was listening to a lot of hip hop, and I took a liking to it because it drew upon a lot of the same sort of musical elements that I was familiar with, but it did so in a way that was rhythmically uh, perhaps a little bit more straightforward, but in a way that I felt that I could seriously appreciate. Um, and and so that's kind of where that all came from. It was just the original music and the jazz tendencies that kind of brought me towards the love for hip hop. and to this day, it's still the old school hip hop. You know, the groups like A Tribe Called Quest or
Hmm.
The Far Side, and a lot of New York groups in particular, Gangstar, that sample a lot of that old jazz that I still love the most.
So, sort of in your memory, what's the first hip hop album that you really remember influencing you?
I would say that would be original soundtrack or OST by People Under the Stairs. They were actually a West Coast group. It's Thes One and Double K, and it's a very feel good, very summery album. But the production is just really crisp, and the subject matter, a lot of the songs is just it's fun. It's about partying and having a good time and having barbecues and whatever in LA. And it just struck me as something that is a little bit more complex, but also can be a little bit more lighthearted than the hip hop that I was familiar with on the radio. And that kind of drove me to understand and to want to understand the genre a little bit more deeply.
For someone who's, I guess, neither into hip hop and nor lives in America, can you just clarify briefly the distinction between West Coast and East Coast hip hop?
For sure. There are different sort of eras of East Coast and West Coast, but they've always been slightly different and somewhat reactive to one another, I suppose. Um, in large part, when I say East Coast hip hop, there's a New York scene, and hip hop really started in New York, and grew out of funk and break beats. And there's a heavy emphasis on lyricism and flow, which was, for all intents and purposes, invented by a gentleman named Rakim in the very early '90s and late '80s. So there's been several different phases, but I feel that the East Coast hip hop has a little bit more of a jazz focus and tends to be a little bit more socially conscious. Now, this is a broad statement, but in general, I think you'll find that most of the information supports that, and most of the groups were a little bit more on the conscious side, and the West Coast hip hop was more funk oriented. You know, you think of like Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre and Tupac Shakur. You know, that gangster rap style was popular in the early '90s. Something of a reaction to the East Coast conscious rap and almost hippie rap movement. You had like groups like De La Soul that were promoting Afrocentrism. And so there was this kind of interesting back and forth, especially during the '90s, topically speaking. And then it kind of got back to the East Coast after the gangster rap and sort of hardcore rap started becoming popular. And then the East Coast went to more hardcore stuff. Like you have Nas, you have Gangstar. And that was a little bit more rhythmically sparse, I suppose. And usually talked about experiences of living in the inner city, but did so in a way that was, you know, very sort of complementary to the lifestyle. And it just, yeah, that's kind of what I feel that I resonate with. I, of course, grew up on the East Coast, so maybe that's why. But yeah, there's lots of minutia to go into, but that's the quick overview.
That's another interview on another topic. We're gonna get back to you. Tell me a bit about your coming up as a musician. So I already know you play the bass, and you recorded Fender Rhodes for your recent EP.
Yes.
What musical instrument did you learn growing up?
So I started on piano when I was, I guess I was 4. I started lessons, and was, for all intents and purposes, classically trained. I took piano lessons formally until I was about 14, when I decided that I wanted to make a band in high school, a rock band, teach myself some guitar, and so I kind of did that. So I decided I wanted to fill out the roles of, you know, the rock band I was in, and so I taught myself guitar, and then from that, you know, bass was kind of a logical extension, and also wound up. I had taken drums for a year, like drum kit, and decided to pick that back up as well whenever I could. So other than piano, I'm self-taught. but
Mhm.
I think I'm, fortunate to have had piano as the basis because I think it translates easiest to just about every other instrument you can find.
And how did you actually progress from playing the drums and guitar and all of these things that were, say, rock or progressive rock oriented
Mhm.
into the electronic realm?
That was basically just a matter of technology.
Hmm.
So when I was in high school, I had originally purchased a big mixer that was functioned as a digital recorder, and that's how I started to learn production. Was actually on the engineering side. Recording drums and all the like instruments. It was a really complicated process. And so when I got my first computer right before I went to the university, um, I realized that I could do that all by myself and not have to rely on other people and set up these, day long sessions. And so I just started tinkering around with the software, trying to figure out how I could use it to make complete productions um, just by myself, completely in the box, just using the software. And so it was really just an exploration for me. And then once I realized that I was capable to some degree of making music like the hip hop that I was really into, that's when I decided, okay, this is really I think what I want to do.
And what was your first digital audio workstation? What did you work on when you started getting into the computer side of things?
So my computer came with GarageBand. I had a MacBook.
Hmm.
Came with GarageBand. I used that for just a little while, and then I found out about Logic, which is kind of the older brother of GarageBand. So I picked that up, Logic 9 originally. And now, and for the past, I guess, 3.5, 4 years, I've been using Ableton 9, which is it's a very different program. It's definitely geared more towards the electronic creator,
It is
but
actually it's a big step. Every time I've taken a look at Ableton, I can't wrap my own head around it. I'm a Cubase guy.
yeah, there's a big learning curve, I think. I was lucky because I managed to get my hands on a manuscript through a professor who
Hmm.
uh, who was writing a book about it. So he was like, "Hey, I'll have you edit the book if you want." And basically, in 2 weeks of going through this manuscript of this book, I learned the program like in no time because I had to spend every day with it. So
Hmm.
in that sense, I kind of sidestepped the learning curve a lot. But it's a difficult program. It's not really laid out like you have Logic and Cubase and Pro Tools, etc., which are a linear program. You have a timeline and you arrange, you sequence just based on that linear timeline. Whereas Ableton, for anybody who doesn't know, is kind of based around its nonlinearity and modularity when it comes to um, musical components. You can essentially create an arrangement by launching different clips within this grid layout, essentially, and change it every single time just based upon the order in which you launch the different clips that correspond to sections or musical phrases or what have you. So it creates a different way of looking at composing and arranging and creating, and I really came to like that after spending a little bit of time with it.
How did it actually change your own way of writing songs? Because once you
Um,
change the way you think about music from linear to, like you said, grid based, I'm sure it
mhm.
affects in some way your own creativity. So, did you notice any change in the way that you work or the way that did your songs start sounding different once you moved to Ableton?
Yeah, I would say so. They on the arrangement side of things, I definitely think that it encourages variation in a way that I was basically building my songs in Logic. I was building them linearly, if
Hmm.
that's even a word, um, by basically adding elements, every X number of measures, and slightly complicating the arrangement as I went along. Whereas Ableton, it was like, okay, I can add all these components here, and then I've got my, this is my section. Why don't I like take a few of these elements, copy them over, and then just write something completely different? And then I can switch between the two very seamlessly and, figure out how this all works together and then transfer this over to a linear arrangement when I'm done or once I have a solid idea or a foundation and then go from there and then we can work on the transitions and everything. It it kind of got me into writing longer songs, I think, because it was much easier to see it all laid out right in front of you on the grid,
Hmm.
um, rather than tiring of, like the same section over and over. Inherently, a lot of what I do is loop oriented, and you kind of have to do that if you're working in the grid in Ableton. It really promotes that, so that's something to be aware of for sure. But it also got me thinking about the process of arranging, as its own process, even with electronic music, both in the horizontal sense, like from time to time, different musical sections,
Hmm.
and then also in the vertical sense, in terms of layering instruments and orchestration, for all intents and purposes. So, in separating those processes, I think it really got me thinking about how it is that I compose my music and how I make beats. And basically, my idea was just like, let's make beats that have the, sort of A B structure, A B A B, maybe a bridge in there, that pop songs have, but they're still beats. They're still instrumental, works that anyone can use. A lot of people have found them as great background music, but there's enough variation, I think, that it merits an active listen. And that was kind of what I found with Ableton.
Hmm. Well, I definitely listen actively to your music. It's not background material at all in my view. Uh, let me go back though to one of the things you said in your reply, which is how Ableton promotes looping in your music writing.
Hmm.
So when you work with loops, what percentage
Yes.
of your loops would you say are sampled, and what percentage are just loops that you record yourself?
Well, I would say for the vast majority of my work, um, a good portion of the harmonic and melodic content comes from samples.
Hmm.
So I'll find old records and I'll sample from the vinyl. And then what I do is like, I never feel content just chopping up, like a 4 bar section from a song and then just plopping it into Ableton with drums over top. My process usually involves chopping it all into very small samples. I'm talking like anywhere from an eighth note length to a half note length,
Hmm.
and then rearranging, and basically using the various chords and melodic turns that exist in the original song, and then splicing together, almost in the sense of a collage, um, a new representation of that just by rearranging the different components. So that usually forms the backbone, and that's how I start normally, is with the sample, and then from there, I usually cut some of the bass out of the sample, and I'll record my own bass line since I'm rearranging, the actual music and the harmony of the sample. I usually find it's worth it to recontextualize by
Hmm.
bringing in my own bass line. So I'll record electric bass, and then whereas, when I was in Logic, I used to use break beats all the time, classic, funk drum breaks that would start in, like the middle of a song, and you take those 4 measures and just like plop them in. Sometimes you chop them up or add some different percussion elements. I don't
Hmm.
really do that as much anymore. I tend to gravitate towards finding individual drum samples that I enjoy, and then I map them to this controller I have. That's a 4x4 grid of pads, and it basically allows me to play the drums with my fingers, like you've seen perhaps. It's much like an MPC, which is the instrument or the sampler of choice, for many years, for the originators of hip hop.
Yeah, you have
So
uh, you
it's
have a set of videos on your YouTube channel called Biro Makes a Beat, right?
That's correct. Hmm.
And I've seen you play these pads there. Are those the same pads you were talking about?
Exactly. Hmm.
Hmm.
So it basically like lays out a full drum kit at your fingertips, and it's just a matter of creating, the vibe through selecting different drum samples that, I guess over the years I've just kind of collected these different sounds from people who record their own, and then from, friends of mine at school. It's like, oh, you have this pack, like let me grab that, I'll trade you for these sounds. And it's fun. It kind of becomes like it's like a trading game of sorts, but eventually you kind of gravitate towards, the sounds that resonate with you. And so I have my collection there, and typically employ those sounds to create my rhythm section there. So, and then I'll add some, sprinkle some synthesizers over top or something. A lot of software going on, and then uh, some auxiliary percussion things. You know, I have like a crate full of tambourines and shakers and a cabasa and like all sorts of stuff there. So I'll record a lot of that stuff myself. Sometimes I'll use pre-existing loops,
Hmm.
but it's all just about, you know, kind of creating the flavor that the sample um, just wants to bring to the table. It's really, I feel like once I have the sample chopped up and sitting nicely, in whatever fashion that might be, it kind of just determines itself at that point.
Hmm.
And I just bring everything in around that. Um, yeah, yeah, yeah.
So you said that you chop elements of other songs and samples into really
Hmm.
small bits that you
Yeah.
then bring back together. Do you do you actually maintain, say, the same harmonic progression as was in the original song, or is it, or do you really try to go for something completely different and just
I
use I'd say maybe the timbre or whatever the flavor of the songs that you sample?
I would definitely say the latter. I always prefer, when possible, to pretty much obliterate the original harmonic progressions,
Hmm.
and even melodies, and to create something completely new. And that's actually where a lot of the playing bass guitar comes in, because you know sometimes I'll add, um, or I'll completely flip the root note. Um, and by playing something in the bass that wasn't necessarily part of the original harmony, it kind of allows a little more flexibility in terms of basically writing a new section from pieces of existing material. Um, so I I basically hold as like my benchmark is like, um, if I can play something, if I can write it down, basically if I can notate whatever I have um, compiled with the samples, and if it would never look like the original song in
Hmm.
terms of just the actual composition and the notes, then I've done my job as a producer.
Hmm.
It should not be recognizable when it comes down to the actual notes. So that's kind of my benchmark.
Really? So let's take a concrete example. Can you give a particular song of yours, say from your recent EP or maybe from one of your previous albums, where you really took a source material and mangled it up in a way that I wouldn't be able to recognize it listening to it?
Sure. Let me think. I would say, I mean, I try to do this wherever possible. Um, I would say one of the best examples. So I've got this track called Weeper on my album Beats 3.
Hmm.
And it samples this piano ballad by a Japanese artist. And I bring this one up in particular because the chorus of the song, or the B section, I suppose, but it really functions as a chorus, um, takes her vocal. Um, and there was a particularly bright and loud and expressive section of her original song. And I was able to chop a new melody, like a completely new melody into it, and create what I think is one of the coolest and saddest and most evocative sections of music that I've made in my career, um, as the B section in this song. Um, I think if you take a listen to it, you'll kind of understand that, you know, while the you might recognize the timbre, for example, if you knew the song already, but in terms of the songwriting, you know, it it's a completely different thing. And you'll hear like the words and everything; they're all jumbled up because it's just, you know, half of a word will be, you know, this note, and then it'll just go to something completely different. So it's cool, but I think it's a good melody, and it works despite the fact that it is completely not what the originator or the composer originally intended.
So now I have to say I'm curious. I'm definitely going to hunt down the original source material and compare the
Hmm.
two. Uh, Now let's go back a bit more, and you mentioned your, you know, the fact that Ableton kind of makes you think in a grid-like fashion, and you've
Hmm.
described your, say, 4 and 4 pad layout. Did you ever consider working with, or did you ever try one of these launch pads where you have a larger grid, say 8 by 8 or 16 by 16? You know, I've seen some big ones. Do you think
Yeah.
is that something you've tried out, or do you want to try out?
I actually have not tried out a Launchpad. It's from my experience, pads are really they're really well tailored for live performance because you have that like bigger grid layout.
Hmm.
And usually when I'm performing live, like Ableton is a great program because it is able to take your music from the studio to a live setting pretty seamlessly.
Hmm.
So those bigger layouts kind of allow you to see more of your live set if you're going to lay it out in terms of that grid. Um, and so it gives you more flexibility than just the 16 pad situation. Um, so I would, I mean, I don't use it for my current live setup just because I have a slightly different way of incorporating all my instruments and then my existing songs into it. But at the same time, it does allow for a different way of looking at the live set. And perhaps if I were to do a little bit more of just like a straight up DJ set, I would probably work with the Launchpad. But as it stands right now, I kind of have a hybrid between playing live instruments. I bring my bass on stage. I have my keyboard handy as well. So I'm playing along with my own songs essentially uh, at the same time. So it kind of necessitates a slightly different approach. It's a
Hmm.
little bit less rigid and grid-like than I guess the Launchpad would engender. So um, that said, there is a lot of merit to that approach, and I think for a lot of types of electronic music, it really works well.
Hmm. How much, or what percentage of your music is actually recorded live, and what percentage do you just sit down and program meticulously?
Um, let's see. It's really just like, it's tough.
Because
It's tough to say
I've
because
seen a drum live on your videos, right? So it looks to
yeah,
me like you do the drums live. Uh,
I always play in my drums. Yeah, that's why that's what I love about the 16 pads is because it's much easier for me to come up with ideas when I can just play them out rather than having to click and drag. It's just not a conducive way to program material. I think
mhm,
interfacing as directly as possible with the instruments that you have. Um, that's always going to be the most organic way to create music,
mhm,
at least for myself. And so I would say like I always play in the drums, but I might meticulously change the timing afterwards. I focus a lot on the sort of micro rhythm. So a lot of times you'll have this type of swing that's a little bit bizarre where your hi-hats might be a little bit late relative to the metronome, but your kick drum will be spot on, and then the snare drum will be a little bit early, and
mhm.
there are like these very minute differences that can completely change the feel of a track, and it's very prominent in hip hop. I will recommend Jay Dilla as recommended listening for anybody interested in how swing can affect the feel of a track, because he was kind of a pioneer of sorts in the R&B and hip hop world. But yeah, it just starts with playing and it starts with feeling. And I do my best to replicate that just with the drum pads and with the bass and everything like that. And then I'll go back in and make sure everything is locked in and working exactly the way I want it to. Um, and that all, like I said, comes from the sample. So once the sample is locked in, it kind of determines the timing of everything else. And then I just do my best to accentuate that groove because rhythm is really the backbone of hip hop, um, and the more solid and the more expressive that can be, then the better, in my opinion.
And what do you start out with? Is it the rhythm track or the samples or something else or?
Pretty much always the samples,
Mhm.
because they really help determine the tempo and everything. It all depends on the original source material and how I chop it. So I'll start with the samples probably 97% of the time.
Mhm. And actually, I'm curious. So, as a drummer, did you pick up the drums before picking up drumming on the pads, or was it the other way around?
Yeah, I actually did. I picked up the drums. I think I was like 8 years old when I started taking lessons for the first time, but that only lasted a year.
Mm.
And then when I was back in high school, around like 14, 15, I started playing again. So I was definitely more familiar with it as the kit instrument than than with the pads. I think that really influenced how I approach programming drums in a very big way.
Really? So when you interface, say, with other musicians who also play the pads, I know if you had the chance, do you
Mhm.
do you see other people approaching drumming on the pads in a different way than you do?
Um, I suppose so. Everybody has their own style, and I can't necessarily speak for all their influences, but
Hmm.
um, it's interesting because a lot of the sort of rhythmic innovations that have happened in hip hop have happened because of the MPC and the drum pads.
Hmm.
Like I said, like Jay Dilla, like his main instrument was the MPC, and so for a lot of people who were inspired by that primarily, um, that kind of does come from not really the jazz school of learning complex rhythms, and it's really just some really inventive person tinkering around with drum pads and samples, and finding a way to express himself through groove that is sort of specific to and has translated to the kit, but really started with the pads. So whether or not everybody has the same influence or works the same way, I can't really say. But at this point, there's such a mashup of um, of inspiration from both kit and jazz drumming and R&B and pop and all this sort of stuff, to the innovations that have come from the existence of the drum pad and just using the fingers as your primary instrument. It's all just kind of a mess, but it's awesome because it's the end product is cool. The end
Hmm.
product is very cool.
Would you consider actually recording live drums for one of your songs at one point?
Oh, absolutely. I would love to. I would love to. I mean, it's difficult because I'm not in school anymore, so I don't have access to the studios that I did,
Hmm.
and it's an expensive endeavor. So I do what I can right now. But yeah, oh my God, I would absolutely love to be able to have ready access to a kit and to be able to play my own drums. That'd be lovely.
And would you actually then try to chop yourself up and rearrange yourself on the pads?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, experimentation is key, I think. And anytime I find myself in the studio, I basically just record a ton of stuff and then, save all the files to my hard drive and then basically try to recall them whenever and however I can
Hmm.
and repurpose them. There's so much you can do with sound design now. If you have a laptop, you have Ableton or Logic or whatever you have, but you can repurpose material in so many different ways. It's just it's just mind blowing. So I do my best to just like collect sounds where possible. I actually have this little field recorder, this just stereo field recorder that I bring around with me a lot of different places. Like when I'm walking around the city, for example, or going into nature even. And you can just take like background noise and through a series of different manipulations, you can create tonal instruments just from a recording of crickets, for example. I mean, it's really just crazy. So drums, absolutely, but guitar, like anything I can get my hands on, sound is sound, and manipulation is one of the most fun aspects, I think, of being a producer. So I'll do everything I can with some source material.
Hmm. And actually, let's talk about the source material itself.
Sure.
I mean, you have a really, really wide palette of different sounds that you use in your compositions.
Hmm.
Uh, I can't really probably even begin to imagine the amount of uh, records and CDs and different sources that you use to sample your
Hmm.
sounds. Suppose that you start out a new song. Where would be your number one place that you turn to look for samples or something to sample from?
So, all right. So, hypothetically, if I were to start a song right now, I would probably reach in. So I do go record shopping a lot and
Hmm.
try to make my way wherever possible to the dollar bin, that's underneath the main section, and just kind of scour records there for cheap, sort of forgotten about, obscure, what have you, grab bag of records and sounds. And so I have a pretty fair collection right now. I'd say about, I don't know, 150 to 200 of said records that may yield something musically interesting, may not. But I would start there, just kind of throw on my turntable, hit the record button in Ableton, and just listen. And that's one of my favorite things about sampling from records is it forces you to actually listen through the entire song when you're ripping it from a vinyl, a vinyl record. And just you have to appreciate the source material. There's when I was starting out, I would just take things off of YouTube or something and just try to hunt my way through the obscura of yesteryear, and it's just a lot more engaging when you really you just have to appreciate what's going on and in the original songs, because there's just so much music out there that was forgotten about that is just so darn good. So that's where I would start. I would start with some of the records that I haven't really touched yet. And if I ever run out, I'll just walk a few blocks to the nearest record store and find some more.
So when you listen to the record, and so you listen through it, and then you come across a point where you say, this is what I'm looking for, and you hit record? Or do you go the other way around? Do you say that you randomly sample and then try to figure out how to put things together?
Usually I'll listen for texture. That is my biggest determinant, and that really just comes down to like instrumentation. I really enjoy a lot of like old school big band orchestra sort of film score stuff. You'll hear that in a lot of my songs where there's horns and strings and these very lush sounds. I'm definitely immediately attracted to that kind of aesthetic for sampling. So I'll usually base my record selection when I'm in the store on the instruments that I see listed on the record itself, and sometimes I'll recognize some players here and there from jazz, and I'll kind of go from there. So texture and instrumentation is really that's really my first determinant of, okay, I'm willing to sample this and then see what's up, and then I'll go play the whole song and record the whole thing into my program, and then usually along the way I'll take notes like, okay, there's this like beautiful melodic turn here, like I definitely want to see what I can do with that, and then I'll just take those moments and just dive deeper and then try to rearrange everything, and sometimes it's fruitful, sometimes it's not. It's really just kind of a crapshoot, but it's after enough time doing this, I kind of learn what my tendencies are and what I'm looking for and what I'm going to work with well. So at this point, I'd say I'm a little bit more efficient than I was, but yeah, that's kind of the selection process.
And after you sample the sounds, are there any sort of ways that you find yourself mangling them up with, or any sort of effects or post-processing tricks that you tend to use over and over?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of, as you can probably tell, popular music and especially underground music has gone through a drastic sonic change over the past, anywhere from 60 to 20 years. So a lot of the stuff I sample was recorded to tape and mastered to a completely different standard, essentially. So I'll start off just by changing sort of the EQ curve of the original sample to just better match the the sonic of today. And then I like to play with spatial effects, like with delays and reverbs, because it can tend to give those records a little bit more space. Just purely talking about mixing and like psychoacoustics, the perception of the sound. And then what I'll do is sometimes I'll hear like a specific sample that will come at a crucial point in the song or in the phrasing, and I'll drop an effect on there, or I'll pan it left and right just for emphasis, or to kind of make things a little bit more trippy, more interesting. I'm a big fan of ear candy, so I'll pepper in these little effects, like just small details here and there that I think for an active listener will hopefully put a smile on their face. but nothing too crazy. I usually try to, try to keep some respect for the original sample in terms of, you know, keeping the overall character there, just enhancing it really where possible.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a bit about your music as a whole and where you're headed to, and
Sure.
and so forth. So, or who would you like, or where would you like to be in, I don't know, a few years' time? What are your long-term aims?
So
Is it just like a hobby for you, or do you see yourself uh, keep growing as a professional musician, or
yeah, I mean, music is at this point my career for sure. I just actually moved to New York City to pursue it full time. So the the idea is basically to have my my music and my my artist persona essentially um, as the main thing carrying me forward. But at the same time, I grew up writing pop and rock songs, and so I've been collaborating with friends and people in New York on pop music and doing co-writes and at the same time working on mixing and mastering and basically I'm just trying to diversify as much as possible because I love music and I love the world of production. I would say in a few years' time, I see myself as a touring artist. My eventual goal is to be able to tour with a live band of some sort. I was really inspired recently by seeing one of my favorite artists, Bonobo. He is an electronic musician, has kind of a similar sound. Like he definitely inspired the music that I make. But he tours every record cycle with a live band. And
how does that work with having sample-based music?
so a lot of like what he does is he actually records his own samples and he plays a lot of instruments and then he'll bring that to the stage and then just basically orchestrate it. And all of his players have charts, I suppose, and they're all just basically playing out the various things that he's recorded. He's also using a computer and triggering sounds, and then he's up center stage playing bass as well. So there's that kind of hybrid technology there that enables you to supplement what you can't create with a live band. All the various electronic samples and stuff can be played out using the computer, using a laptop. And so eventually when I say live band, I'm referring to the material more from my latest EP, which is no samples. It was something I wrote out completely. It's all through composed. And so that's kind of the direction I'm heading in more, because as much as I love sampling to death, there are just, I guess, certain musical tendencies I want to explore more, and some sound design that I don't really get the opportunity to mess with too much when I'm using samples. So as I kind of move forward, I'm composing more directly, and so I kind of see myself promoting that aesthetic a little bit more as I go forward. So
do you see the center of your activity being in the studio or on the stage live?
I would say still in the studio, but as with any artist or musician, you're going to spend long periods of time on the stage. So I'm assuming that I'm going to, kind of transition back and forth. Just want to keep my hand in good practice, because there's definitely going to be times when I'm on tour where I'm, sick of whatever I'm doing. And, it's good to have a laptop there and just be able to, crank out a beat here and there, just, when I need to relax, essentially. So I still see myself as primarily a studio guy. But as I play more and more shows, I'm realizing how much fun it is to actually play in front of people. Even the electronic music that can seem very rigid, it's like, I'm working on my set where I have keyboard and bass and everything, and I try to keep things spontaneous, and it's actually so much fun. When it flows, it's a blast. So I definitely want to keep that going and develop that a little further. And, as I create more music, to be able to bring that to the stage, definitely a priority of mine.
Hmm. Do you actually have maybe a website or a link where you uh, publicize your performances that I could put in
I
the description?
I actually don't have much live video. Unfortunately, that is something I'm working on because I
No, I
haven't
mean
played.
like actual links to performances. Like if you have upcoming
Oh, sure.
shows,
Yeah,
I can put links in the description, or maybe there's like a website where you sort of aggregate your upcoming performances or something that the viewers, if there's anyone in New York City who wants to
mhm,
go have a listen, I'm sure they'd appreciate like a link or something.
absolutely. So I put here. I'll send you this link here. This is a Songkick, which is kind of like a tour aggregator, and um, so they have. I think that's the link. It's like it's different because there's a user profile and um, then there's like an artist profile. So let me double check that that's the right link.
Yeah,
Might
it's okay.
not be.
I mean, you can check after the interview, but I'll put the link, the correct link down in the video description. So if you're listening to us now, just take a look in the description itself, and you'll find all of the relevant links.
There you go.
Uh,
Uh,
Thanks.
yeah,
And
of course. I think that's the right one there. And then, also I put all my information on Facebook and everything. I have a Facebook page. It's just facebook.com/bureaucratic. And I always post about, news and songs, everything you can find through that feed there.
uh, so, a question that interests me: do you or would you consider or would you think about adding lyrics to your music down the road, or do you view yourself strictly as an instrumentalist?
I am actually working with some vocalists and some lyricists. I'm not the best lyricist myself, so I probably
Hmm.
wouldn't handle that um, entirely myself. But having just moved back to New York and being surrounded by some of my former classmates who do make vocal music, it feels almost silly to keep just confined to the instrumental space. So I'm very much looking forward to introducing lyrics and vocals, and it's a whole different world, and I'm excited to explore it.
Hmm.
So that's for absolutely sure. It's coming very soon, as a matter of fact.
How do you think, or how do you learn that most people discover your music?
Frankly, through YouTube. I think when I was just starting out, I had maybe like 400 followers on SoundCloud, like really relatively a baby in my career. And then
Hmm.
it was back in 2013, BuzzFeed, when they were starting out. Um, their video department, they were doing like these list videos, and they used my music a couple times. And I just had them link to my Bandcamp site,
Hmm.
which is great. So basically, they were just getting like hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of ears on my music for free,
Hmm.
and then directing people, anyone who was interested in what they were hearing, could just click the link, um, and from there, I mean, that's how, for example, I believe Kick the PJ, the channel that you were talking about before, that you discovered my music from, that all kind of stemmed from that BuzzFeed discovery, because a lot of people aimed to imitate them
Hmm.
for all intents and purposes, and so they're a very influential company. So I basically grew that into like a significant component of my business. Now I work with a lot of vloggers and aspiring YouTubers and people who do this for their career, and basically just you know make a deal where it's like, hey, you can use my music for free as long as you credit me appropriately, and
Hmm.
if you have a big enough audience, it just like does nothing but help. It's just a really awesome vehicle for a lot of instrumental music, and a lot of friends of mine as well have been able to take advantage of that too. So it was just like a big stroke of fortune originally, but it's just a matter of turning that opportunity into something that's able to sustain, and so that's what I've been trying to do for a while.
Hmm.
Um, and then there's also like there's SoundCloud. A lot of people find me on Spotify as well. I have a lot of my music on Spotify. And so I've been on a couple nice playlists, and those are always great vehicles for discovery. Spotify is exploding right now in the States, and so yeah, it's
Yeah.
all good. I mean, just trying to have my music everywhere possible, and eventually it finds its way to people.
Hmm. Uh, so I think we're going to maybe conclude by talking a bit about your latest release, which is Replace, right? You had an EP
Mhm.
out.
Mhm.
Uh, it's maybe like a year, half a year old by now.
Yeah,
What
a
it?
couple months. It came out October 3rd, so it's
Ah, it's actually.
four.
Oh. And like you said, it's your first experiment that is completely devoid of samples, right?
That's correct.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Absolutely. So, when I say it's devoid of samples, it's devoid of third party. I wasn't sampling any records on
Hmm.
this EP. So it's 5 tracks. Each one was actually written originally as a draft um, between 3 and 4 years ago, and these drafts sat on my computer for a long time. And I didn't really have the courage to explore them fully and put them out because I had committed to this sample based sound. I wasn't sure how people would react, and if I would lose fans or whatever if I started putting out this more experimental, jazz oriented stuff.
Hmm.
But eventually I realized that it was something I really wanted to do. I was really in love with these songs, and it was silly to let them sit on my hard drive for eternity and never actually put them out. So I decided, I called up my friend who lives in Philadelphia, and went over his place. And we recorded all 5 of them in one night. And he's a jazz guy, so he embellished a lot and did some things that I never really grew up with jazz theory, just kind of an appreciation for it.
Hmm.
Um, so I kind of let him do his thing, and then took those recordings back to my home where I produce, and then did a lot of manipulation and editing. So it's kind of grew from several different ideas, from the draft to the recording, and then editing those. It kind of transformed along the way, and that was a really interesting process because it was basically treating my recordings as samples because I manipulated them in a lot of ways that I do with sampled material.
Hmm.
So and at the same time, it was myself, which is really cool. So um, yeah, it's basically just a matter of looking at it like, where do I go next if I stop sampling and if I generate my own sonic aesthetic. And that was kind of the best example. This was my first foot forward, but also um, I think some of the best music I've ever written. So I'm very very pleased with how it turned out.
Definitely, I really enjoyed listening to it and to many of your other albums as well.
Thank
Uh,
you.
I'm sure the listeners will enjoy listening to your recordings as well. So I urge everyone to check out the links in the description. And I'd like to thank you again, Brandon, for agreeing to interview and sharing all of your insights and ways of looking at music with me and with the viewers themselves. So thanks.
Absolutely, man. It's my pleasure. And thank you for having me.